Hi everyone, this is Ali John Chaudhary, psychotherapist, and we are here today with Fern Schumer Chapman, author, and today in Brothers, Sisters, Strangers video podcast, we're going to be doing an episode on personalization and sibling estrangement. Now, this is something that's been coming up more and more in our groups as we've been evolving and as our community has been growing. We've been seeing this more and more, so we thought it was very important for us to do an episode on this particular subject. Now, Fern, I understand that you have a story you wanted to share with us.
I always have a story I want to share with you, but this one I think is particularly relevant. When I was in my 20s, I worked at a newspaper, and a colleague said something to me that absolutely struck me as radical. But of course, thinking back on it, it's so obvious. But at the time, it was a whole new look at my responsibilities. And what she said is, you are not responsible for anyone else's feelings. Well, I came from a family where my mother was a Holocaust refugee, and she had lost so much that she placed her needs and her emotional life on me. And so I felt a huge responsibility to fulfill all that she had lost. And as a result, I feel I personalized my failure because, of course, you can never fill somebody else's emotional life. And so this speaks to me very directly. I really had this sense that I should have been more to my mother, and I've actually written quite a bit about this in a memoir called Motherland. There is an emotional legacy and a psychological legacy to those who lost everything in childhood and then transmit those needs to their own children and expect them to fulfill those needs.
That's a very, very personal and poignant story that you just shared there. I think that that's something that is so important for us and our community because these patterns are learned sometimes from a very young age. And like you say, it could be from a variety of different experiences, sometimes happening to the previous generation, where all of a sudden you're forced to adapt or take on certain things. So I think this is an interesting segue into this subject. You know, people need to understand that it's really about taking on something which is not ours. Right? Mm-hmm. And I think that that's kind of what's been happening with you, I think, from what you've described, and also what's happening with our community. It's a type of over-responsibility that manifests as a need to almost give order to an otherwise unexplainable situation. And oftentimes it's based on incomplete information with regards to sibling estrangement, you know, or other issues in our lives. So,
well, I think too that if you're programmed at a young age, you expect that you will fill others' needs. So when my brother cut me off, my first response was, what did I do? How can I fix this? And of course, that leads to patterns of rumination, which I know we're going to get into. But that was my go-to. And of course, looking back at that, it seems like the completely wrong approach, because I'm not responsible for all of this. I didn't do all of this. And in fact, I did very little of it. Mm-hmm. He was the one who chose to cut me off. So
exactly. And you're absolutely right. When it's something that happens to us and we're faced with this incomplete information, you know, that is certainly something that the mind can tend to fall into with regards to rumination, you know, and when that hamster wheel really starts to turn, we start to revisit and re-experience past conversations, past situations, often with that sense of increased pressure, emotional pain towards ourselves. And that's when we can really start to be harsh towards our own person in that way.
Yeah, it's like every loss brings up every other loss you've had. Every rejection brings up every other rejection you've had.
Yeah.
And all of this is personalization. All of this is sort of self-battering. Because somehow you feel you failed. Well, you know, in the case of my mother, I couldn't give her what she'd lost. It was impossible. And yet I put that expectation on myself.
Exactly. So I think that that's something that's really, really important for us to realize in terms of what we do, how this manifests and such, you know, and we tend to dwell on how we reacted, how we didn't react, right? How time passed by and nothing changed in some cases. There's many of these aspects that really lead to rumination when you think about it. And regardless of how our siblings did, nothing makes things better. And that's the thing that happens when it comes to that. It's really difficult when it comes to that, because we become our own worst critics, I find.
Well, and then you judge yourself, as I was saying earlier, as a failure because you couldn't meet these unrealistic expectations that somebody put on you or you put on yourself.
Mm-hmm. And if we're not careful, we can have feelings of sadness, guilt, shame, anger that can be pretty much unjustified or unfounded. And we've talked about this before in terms of what certain feelings can do to us. There's what loneliness can do to us, but there's also what these feelings, if they're not dealt with or processed in a healthy way, that can also have a detrimental effect on us. So all the more reason to work on those feelings in that way and identify where these mental patterns can sometimes appear and cause us to fall into rumination.
Yeah. We're often the target of someone else's internal battle. And it's really important when we start to personalize that we recognize somebody else's battle and that we're not a part of it.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to remember. Like you said, it is about another person. At the same time, I think that what's important as well is just, finding out what we can do in some ways to reduce rumination, since we're kind of going into that. How can we reduce personalization that comes with rumination? And first of all, I think the most important thing is to recognize that it's an interpersonal process, and that because of this, we can learn to dispute our interpretation of events, because that's really what it is. And common thoughts that people have are, for example, one of them is, why can't I get along with them? I'm a diplomatic person. There must be something wrong with me. So already from the go. Yeah.
Which, by the way, is its own cage. You're creating your own cage and keeping yourself locked in it. And that's what rumination is.
Exactly. And in reality, it's important that you come back to having more of a proactive response to that. Because if you come to that realization that you've probably tried several times to make it work, and in reality, how many times have your attempts been thwarted? I think that's important to kind of think about that whenever you get into one of these personalization patterns, right? How many times have you tried to make it work, And another one that we can have also as a personalization pattern is, here I go again, becoming emotional and losing my cool with them. So that's an important one as well, I find, because people tend to judge themselves in terms of their own personal reaction,
And I think, what do you really own? What is really yours? And that's been the question that I've had to ask myself over and over again. What am I truly responsible for? And if I am responsible for myself first, how do these other people's needs fit into that?
And that's a very, very good question, to question ourselves and to ask that, and something else we can say to ourselves as well as a proactive response is, I'm reacting to toxic behaviors which involve speaking up and protecting myself. And this can be unpleasant, but necessary for my well-being. So that's important for us to tell ourselves that whenever we start to have certain reactions that are out of character for ourselves, it's important to remember why it's happening, and to just be gentle towards ourselves when it comes to that.
I have a good friend whenever I start to ruminate, who always uses the same line on me, which is, let me give you correct thinking. So I would encourage all of our audience members to have correct thinking.
Yeah, that's very important. I completely agree with you. It's good to think about it along those lines. Another type of personalization pattern is, why aren't you fixing this? What aren't you saying or doing that could make it better? Like, what am I missing? And I always like to warn my clients when it comes to that, because the whole idea of turning up every single rock and to think that somehow there must be a rock that's left unturned, and if I can only find that rock, then everything will get better. You know, I think that that's a more subtle form of personalization, because it involves an endless searching, right, with incomplete information. And that's where that inner pressure we're talking about happens, right, when it comes to rumination.
It's actually just magical thinking.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that that's the thing that we really need to be careful with, because you know, it's you're coming at it from a legitimate point of view. You want to, of course, find answers, but at the same time, a good proactive response for that is to also tell ourselves, it's not up to me to find all of the answers. This isn't about me. It's about them. And I don't need to be the fixer in this. I only need to empower myself here. So that's a great example of what we can say to ourselves whenever we fall into one of those personalization patterns of trying to seek that unturned rock, you know. So yeah.
It comes back to my point in the beginning, which is you are not responsible for anyone else's feelings.
That's very true. So I think we're almost out of time here, Fern. So I just wanted for us to talk about resources. It's great, of course, to have you here, and I really appreciate the fact that your articles in Psychology Today are doing so well. It's really opening up a dialogue and a discussion and taking the pulse of something that is happening on a very deep level with the general public. Of course, there's your book, Brothers, Sisters, Strangers, Sibling Estrangement and the Road to Reconciliation, which is a great book when it comes to highlighting what people are experiencing when it comes to their sibling estrangement, and how, of course, you talk about your brother and how it's created a bit of a delicate situation when it comes to reconciliation. So I think that that's an important book, because if people need to see what that can look like, that's great, because it's not always rosy, but it's necessary in to know what that can be to be healthy. And at the same time, you know, there is, of course, the sibling estrangement support group that we have, of course, on Zoom. It is a very thriving group in that way, and it is helpful to a number of us that need to break isolation and, of course, to feel empowered and build resources. I host that group. That's something that's very important for our community. And of course, there's Sibling Estrangement, Sharing, Coping, Connecting, which is the Facebook group that we have. That is also a very thriving community where people support each other, and it's a very safe place to do so, and it's a private group. So it's something that I encourage our viewers to register and join on in. Of course, there is your Facebook page as well. You're on Facebook, which I think is very good and chock full of resources as well. And of course, there is the UK group, which we have started up as well. And that is also very helpful to people that can't make it within the Eastern time that we have at 6 p.m. And of course, there is my website, siblingestrangement.com, that has, of course, informative articles on sibling estrangement and how to empower ourselves and to learn more about this and how this can impact us. So those are the resources we have right now. And I do encourage our viewers to look at those and to continue their journey of empowerment towards that. So
I just wanted to add too, for those who are interested in the psychological legacy of the Holocaust and how it affected the next generation, I've written a memoir called Motherland, which is about returning with my mother to her little town in Germany, and how that experience made me understand who she was and how the Holocaust had defined her.
That's very important. Thank you for sharing that, Fern. So again, thank you for being here. It's always a pleasure to be able to talk with you like this and to be able to deepen the conversation that needs to be had about this important subject. I do look forward to our next talk again in our subsequent videos. So thank you again for being here, and we'll talk soon.
Great. I love that.
All right, take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.